Like I said, I would have just opted for not. I would have gone for the greenfield look.
I enjoy the new perspectives on the subject, you know, that has been written on general and so forth. But I just wanted, I know categories you mentioned. And I remember when I first went there, Dee was doing research there. She found the graves it's still
the graves are still there. Some of the things have been removed. So the traces a while back, the wood railings that went around the graves were actually removed here at the art and storage at the research center.
and
So
the
it was
gatepost.
there.
She,
Yeah,
did
they-
she,
the gate,
you were in touch with her.
yeah.
See what all,
Yes.
obviously, they didn't do a lot of, it was mainly surface.
She was mainly
But
surface.
as you said, I agree with you that other people have been excavated there. Most Farquarson have many more artifacts than you said you found. But,
And the slave quarter is far more, we have Kathy's material from one excavation. She excavated one of the slave quarters. And we have her complete catalog and artifacts from the manor house. And even if you add it all together, the slave quarter looks the richest. And it's not just the borrowing that you see at American plantations or the continued hand-me-downs. It's just there's more, it hasn't been picked over. It's, you know, I think that's really what it's looking like archaeologically. So, yeah.
but one more question, the manor house, you brought in the Scottish comparison. Do you think the manor house and prospect of Plantation was a one-story? I always thought it was.
It has a pediment, but the walls on either end are still standing, and it does come to a pediment, but it's a much lower pediment than it is in Sandy Point.
Yes.
I don't believe you could have stood upright on the second floor. So it's very, and the windows
So
are
it
very,
probably
very
had a
small.
little attic, but-
And a little attic, but not a really livable space to use. What's really odd is they actually divide an interior room that would have meant that the room behind it would have had absolutely no ocean breezes. So it's a really bizarre setup, which is a very typical design in Scotland. But there you would actually have created a room that all the windows were landward and none of the windows were windward.
So you say, why are so many plantations on the east side? When you think, well, I guess the harbor is in the south, but the better,
The better soil was on the east.
all the soil.
Yeah.
Yes. Say in the front, and then we'll get to the back again. No, go right ahead, please.
Were the plantations all going at the same time? What's the time?
They all start around the same time. They all end at different times. So the influx seems to be very similar. Not right in the 1780s. We don't have a lot of suggestion that it's the moment. You know, I think it takes a few years to get your land track up and going and things like that. But what we really see are different endings. So they're all starting at a very similar time. There's probably some overlap for all of these planters at one point on the island, and then they're leaving at different times for personal circumstances. So yes, there would have been about a 10-year heyday where Salvador would have been bustling.
About 1810, this would have been the place to be, but
What would that 10-year period be?
late 17, about very late 1790s to about 1810 is when most of the major land grants are being made here. So it's a late developer. Other islands developed first, and this was a somewhat late developer.
And a lot of the planters on St. Salvador have holdings elsewhere. So the person who we think built Polyville, although we have no direct records, if it is the Allwards as we think, have major of their primary plantation somewhere else. William Kerr has his primary plantation somewhere else. So this doesn't seem to be most people's first plantation choice, or first primary plantation residence.
And that's typical of what was happening in the Southern Islands, that planter would have more than one
Yes.
plantation.
Yeah, and these just, and I don't know if this is true for everyone, but these planters all have their major holdings on Exuma. So it would have been a larger plantation, or their, was on Exuma.
We gotta go to the back.
Yes,
Then we'll get to.
there are two questions. One is a follow-up on that one. The density of plantation seems quite extraordinary for Salvador being a small island. You may not want to comment on that or not. I mean, was the Bahamas spread out like that with so many plantations? The other question I have is a technical one. We have a very little topsoil, as you know, in the Bahamas. How does one stratify? In other words, determine that the light bulbs didn't date back to the Lucayans, and that the other things like that. How do you stratify and judge the age?
Sure, why don't you do the second?
I'll do the second question first, and we'll let the historian tackle land grants and plantations. Archaeology in the Caribbean, when we first came here, I have, colleagues who said it's a lot like kicking the rocks around. You kick something and look and see what's underneath it, because there isn't. So the typical sort of stratification methods that are used are not used in the Caribbean. So it's what archaeologists call horizontal stratigraphy. But the thing about it, so the Lucayan sites do have stratigraphy. They're built on sand dunes. So they have meters and meters of soil. These historic sites, because the planters are choosing to build their houses up, are building as close to bedrock as possible. So they're actually doing the archaeological opposite of the Lucayans. They're picking the place with the least soil to situate their plantations. So actually, the dating has to be done by horizontal associations. In other words, how close artifacts are concentrated with particular buildings and areas of the sites. We do very systematic, precise collections horizontally of locations to look for patterns of distribution. And then artifacts in the historic period are so highly datable. People change the stamps on the back of the ceramics every couple of years. You show me a plate with a design, I can tell you usually if it has a printed design on it, when it was made to within 5 years. So you can see subtle changes. Electric companies all have patterns. So a light bulb has a stamp on it somewhere that has a patent number. And you tell a student of yours to do some great research. They go find the patent number for you, and it has the date of when it's patented, the range of the company history. So you're using the historic sources and the proximity in horizontal space, not vertical space, to give you your change, how things are changing on the plantation. So like when we showed you Polly Hill, those domestic slave quarters have artifacts dating into the 1840s. The manor house has artifacts that end around 1810. And the office has this entire big reoccupation with artifacts from the 1870s to the 1930s that don't show up other places. So it's a different type of strategy here, but the same basic principles. It just doesn't work the way you expect. And then John, you can hear.
Well, actually, Dr. Saunders could probably answer it even better than
That's
I'm
true.
probably answering it from her book. But you do find planters really going, in the period, in the Loyalist period, going from occupying very few islands to frankly occupying most of the islands. But the thing you have to be really careful of is land grants are given left and right. The question is what's actually being occupied and turned into a plantation. And that really requires some kind of archaeological survey to really, certainly the slave registers are very useful because it means by the 1820s we can actually count, based on the slave registers, how many groups of slaves there are on each island. But the other thing that's really crucial, particularly for this earlier period, because clearly some of these plantations were abandoned before there was ever a slave register, is really to do an archaeological survey of how many extant plantation sites seem to be on any one plantation. But, on any one island, yes. So, but I think that it was a fairly dense initial occupation of these islands. So dense in the sense of there are islands with just 2 plantations. So planters didn't want to go somewhere where there was only going to be one neighbor.
But there are unnamed plantations on San Salvador that are not where we don't have slave registers for them. You have to be a very brave soul to get to them. Nobody has a name for them, and they probably weren't operating for very long. They're probably, quick boom and bust. You go, it doesn't work, you leave. So there were, just like there are land grants with no plantations, there are plantations with no records. So there's a lot of orphans in both ways there.
And I don't know that I think San Salvador has been more studied than other islands, but I don't know that it was any more densely populated. There are more slave registers in 1822 for Cat Island than there are for San Salvador. San Salvador has just been really well studied.
Any research on plantations in Cat Island?
No, I think it would be a great thing for somebody to do.
It's very
So,
rich because I'm a little afraid of the people are going now and clearing up the tourists,
Tourists, yeah.
but, you know, it should be done by professionals. And I think it's a touristic thing.
Yeah.
And you know, we recently was found a Hunter Plantation in the south was Port Howe, and that's where Joseph Hunter had his plantation, and that's where that very infamous rebellion took place. Dick actually was executed because he fired at the Hunter, and he led a revolt. He was executed, but they were scared to execute the others who rebelled him because they were scared of another uprising. So, and that's a, I hope you all get that. Somebody does.
Yeah.
It's that and the women rich plantation.
And it's supposed to plant the richest soil.
But others, I think what we've done on San Salvador can be done on any of the islands. And I think one of the things that will start to show up, my gut instinct is that while there are things that are distinctly Bahamian, there are also things that probably are distinctive cultural elements of each of these islands as they develop, which you would start to see in a systematic archaeological study.
We invite some of us to
Yeah.
go to Canada.
Yeah.
I have two questions. My first is, what happened to Charles Farquarson? And how many children did he have, and how did, what happened to the descendants? And my second question is, how many slaves did he have, and did they leave after he abandoned?
Let me think. He died around emancipation.